Sennacherib deals with that. But before we do, let's look a little bit closer at the plan of Kuyunjik itself, the main mound at the city of Nineveh, and the plan of the southwest palace of Sennacherib. This is known also as the palace without rival. Did I put Northwest Palace? I did put Northwest Palace. Northwest is I'm sorry, this is the Southwest Palace, not to be confused with the Northwest Palace at Nimrud. The palace itself is a marvel of engineering and artistic execution. We actually see the, again, plan of the palace echoes previous Assyrian plans, right, with an outer courtyard and an inner courtyard and a throne room. Here's the main throne room. This room actually is probably non-existent. This is probably just the niche in which the throne sat, but the excavators thought it continued into a main room. But we have right, an entrance, a throne room facing a large outer courtyard, right, an inner courtyard with a series of rooms and chambers that actually are completely covered in reliefs. So unlike Khorsabad, this palace was occupied for many, many years, and the entire program of artistic decoration was able to be carried out. So we have 70 interior rooms that would have served multiple purposes, but nearly all of them are actually covered in these fantastic reliefs. Over 2,000 reliefs, which total over 1.5 miles of carved stone reliefs running throughout this palace. It would have been absolutely spectacular to observe. All of the doorways, 27 doorways, for example, those entering into the throne room, entering out of and into these secondary rooms, were flanked by lamassu. So 27 sets of lamassu were recovered from the palace at Nimrud. And as you can see, the artistic conventions are changing a little bit. This unfamiliarity with three-dimensional design, the kind of discomfort that we see in the reign of Ashurnasirpal II is now completely gone by the time we reach Sennacherib. You can see here, even at Khorsabad, the lamassu of Sargon II still have that fifth leg, that kind of strange vestigial leg, because the artists were uncomfortable removing it, making it seem as though the lamassu from the side was somehow unstable. By the time the artists of Nineveh were building the palace, the Northwest Palace there, they've removed it entirely. So a new conception of space, which also goes hand in hand with the perspective used in these reliefs themselves. We saw the use of perspective at Nimrud, at the Southwest Palace of Ashurnasirpal II. Really what's a worm's eye view, right? The use of registers, the perspective is almost from the ground up. By the time of Sargon II at Khorsabad, right, we've almost got this bird's eye view looking down on these large compositions, right, where we see a foreground, a middle ground, and a background in which the use of registers is almost entirely abandoned, right? Think of those seascapes that we saw of the ships bringing timber back from or down the coast of the Mediterranean of Sargon II. That's continued during the reign of Sennacherib at Nineveh. So again, right, finally these Assyrian artists are getting a bit more comfortable with their use of perspective. Again, these 2,000 reliefs from various throne rooms are characterized by the use of small figures scattered in large compositional scenes. And what we see, especially in this inner courtyard, you can see here, are scenes of warfare, but in addition to scenes of warfare, elaborate reliefs depicting the engineering projects of Sennacherib. So let's take a look at some of these in a little bit more depth. We'll take a look at this image. And why don't you take a stab and tell me what you see in this image. You guys are familiar enough with Assyrian images. But again, the perspective is one in which we have a foreground, a middle ground, a background, and then even a far background. So tell me a little bit about this image. What are some of the things, what's going on here, for one thing, you have to interpret? I'll give you a few moments to digest it. What are some things that pop out in this scene? What do you think is taking place? Yeah. Right. So we see for one thing different people, absolutely, depicted in different ways. So two things. One, right, there's an inscription that clearly states what's taking place. And we've seen this combination of text and image play out, right, as early as Ashurnasirpal II, right, with the standard inscription sort of thrown up on these reliefs of whether it's a tributary, whether it's a religious scene with an Apkallu figure, you know, pollinating something. It's always the same inscription over and over. In these reliefs, we actually have specific inscriptions that say exactly what's taking place. So, right, the central inscription, which is almost kind of like a cartoon bubble, which describes what's happening in the scene. So the second thing you mentioned was, right, so yeah, actually what's taking place, right, we can see is quarrying or mining of large stone blocks. You can see these individuals sort of crouched down, chipping away at what is a very large stone block with gangs of people bringing the sort of refuse and distributing it. You can actually see the bucket chains, really, of material being carried and then dumped out. What over here? What's taking place here? Is that clear? It's a little difficult to see. Disciplining the right. So probably this is not voluntary labor, right? I mean, this is somebody actually whipping and taking control of or disciplining these forced laborers. And what we see too, right, in this upper and lower register are troops, right? Who are just sort of idly standing by, watching this labor take place. This is conscriptive labor. And you mentioned the hats, and that's excellent observation. We have the difference not only in terms of the headgear and the weapons determining who is Assyrian and who is not, but in these gangs of people themselves, each one is depicted differently, with different attributes, different headgear, different clothing, if you look close enough, which sort of, again, is an Assyrian way of showing these are captured people, deported people, whether they're Aramaeans or Chaldeans or Israelites. They're now, under the control of Assyria and made to work these massive working projects. Let's take a look at some of these other ones. So actually we have a series of these reliefs, again, from this inner courtyard. And it's interesting that these reliefs are in an inner courtyard, not the outer courtyard, right? It makes you wonder who these reliefs are intended for. Certainly they're not impressing foreign diplomats who are coming, to do business with the king. And it's thought that perhaps Sennacherib is sort of, showing his prowess and his genius, if you will, in these engineering projects, and sort of preaching to the choir, preaching to his own inner circle, at which there might have been a lot of disrepute, a lot of trouble and unrest. And we do know that actually Sennacherib was killed by his own sons in a palace upheaval. So it's possible that might be part of the reason for having all of these reliefs everywhere, to control not just foreigners, but also to control your own people inside the palace. So we've got our block, right, which is being carved out. Next scene over, we actually see what this block is going to be, which, is going to be one of these large lamassu. And as you can see, it's actually carved in place. Now, why would you carve it in place? instead of just taking the block all the way back and doing your carving at Nineveh. I mean, you're going to be transporting this thing several miles. Again, right, this area is not natural. It doesn't have rock naturally. Yeah?
It would be lighter after carving?
Absolutely, right? So you can see here that Sennacherib's gone as far to show us that this block, all the excess weight that can be taken off of it, insight is taken off. Because you don't want to be carrying this huge block if you don't have to. But you can also see that the details of that statue have yet to be filled out. And that's something that would take place once it arrived back at Nineveh. Again, these chains of individuals who are being led right by their Assyrian foreman, and even the king looking on and sort of, again, toasting this effort that's taking place to build this massive palace at Nineveh. Also mention again the background and the attention to detail, the regions that these are coming from. And these again, go hand in hand with Assyrian texts that talk about scouting out and surveying new regions for resources, like stone. The final one we'll look at here is the movement of this Lamassu as it makes its way to Nineveh. And again, you can see the emphasis on depicting the actual process used. Sennacherib went very far to really show the ingenuity of the Assyrians in moving these massive sculptures. You can see this one is actually supported with blocks to keep it from cracking while it's being moved. And it's been set up on a wooden sledge, almost like a boat, which is rolling on small, thin dowels or logs, right? So these would be put in front. They would transition to the back as the Lamassu was being pushed along the earth, and then right, these would be picked up again. You can see them being picked up and then carried all the way back to the front again. So really just fantastic. A large lever being used to kind of push it over obstacles, and then of course your labor force dragging it along, making this possible. So again, the emphasis on engineering projects, whether it's the movement of these large Lamassu or canalization and irrigation, this is very typical of Sennacherib. So Sennacherib also uses narrative, right? We've got this before, during, and after in these scenes of engineering. That said, Sennacherib, again, is an Assyrian king, and he has to deal with these rebellions in the far west, in Judah, and then also in the south in Babylon. And so as a result, of course, he goes on campaign to try to quell these, and also the results of those campaigns, particularly the campaigns of the first 4 years of his reign, are also depicted at Nineveh. And also, again, shown in very strong, sharp detail. What we find in the heart of the palace, we actually see a series of rooms leading from this courtyard that are completely covered in battle reliefs. And at the very heart of these rooms, as you can see here, is room 36. This is a very special room for a number of reasons. You can see from the courtyard, you would have to pass through 2 other chambers before reaching it. And each of those doorways that you pass through is actually flanked by a set of Lamassu. And again, this issue of, right, the Assyrians finally kind of getting a hold of perspective. It's another example of them. The Lamassu actually gets smaller the farther you go in. So these ones on the outside would have been much larger, a bit smaller, and a bit smaller, which would have given you the impression of standing here in this courtyard that the length from where you're standing to room 36 was much longer than